Stead, we're live.
And that was the great famous voice of Larry the Liberty Guy as we do our last show before we break for July 4th and for the summer. We'll tell you more about that at the end of the show. Today, welcome in the Dugout. Mike Stenhouse back with you on this Independence Day celebration weekend. I wish more Americans were celebrating. We're going to get into that today. Main topic of my commentary is the real story of the Star Spangled Banner. More about that in a second. We also have three really terrific guest segments today. We've got some nationally accredited people, and of course, Dr. Bostom will close out our show today on the just absurd press conference we heard yesterday by our state educational, health, and executive leaders about just the mandates they're putting on kids, and the hysteria continues over this COVID pandemic. First up today will be, as a guest, will be a Liberty Bite piece. We've done some Liberty Bites before. Julie Gunlock from Independent Women's Forum on, again, the absurdity, I'll use that word a lot today, I guess, absurdity of the pay equity bill that is about to be passed, probably being voted on right now in the House and the Senate as we speak, and will be signed into law probably next week by the governor. This unnecessary and frivolous bill and how it might backfire on women. Our second guest is Nikki Niley. She's the founder and president of the national group, Parents Defending Education. They're the group that was called out for being racist. I should say incorrectly called out for being racist by that South Kingston school committee board member. They're the group, this is the group they were referring to. So we're going to hear directly from them on that. And then, as we said, Dr. Andrew Bostom will finish things up. Okay, it's July 4th weekend. So I'm going all in with the colors. I got my red and white striped shirt. And of course, I've got my flag cap on. And what I want to talk about today in the open is the Star Spangled Banner. Only recently did I ever, I casually knew what Francis Scott Key and the Star Spangled Banner, but only in the last little while have I really dug in and learned the true history of that. So as we prepare to celebrate Independence Day, and we remember the ideals that this nation was founded upon, how so many women fought for that independence in the first place during the Revolutionary War, then fought to maintain that independence, not just for us, but for others around the world and in other wars, how we fought to give that same level of freedom to the slaves in the South during the Civil War. I mean, and the flag was always the symbol of that freedom. That's what the American flag stands for. Of course, we've been imperfect in executing those ideals, but the ideals themselves are the most noble and erudite, if you would, that this world has ever seen. So, we all believe, though, we believe all of us created equal by our Creator. But that core ideal is under attack by all these Marxist groups and Marxist agendas that we see out there that are being forced into every aspect of our society. We've been focusing a lot on schools, but it's being forced everywhere. So I think this 4th of July, those of us who are patriots will feel a little bit more important to celebrate and to defend, proactively defend those values that we believe in, those holy values, and to save our country from these anti-American concepts and theories that just a year or two ago we never thought could have achieved such prominence, but it has. And I don't think anything has brought that to light more, than the recent spectacle that we talked about a couple times on this show of the athlete, the Olympian Gwen Berry, standing there, dissing the flag, turning her back on the anthem and the flag of the country that she's going to be representing in Tokyo this month, later in July. This month, we're in July now. And she claims that she did so because the Star Spangled Banner is a racist poem, song, whatever. Now she's referring to a verse or to a phrase in the third verse of that song, the third verse that none of us know anything about. But she's wrong about that. She's ignorant. The ignorance of the left and the spin of the left is stunning. So we're going to get into that. First, I'm going to tell you the whole story, not the whole story, but some of the story that you may not realize. So Star Spangled Banner, well, picture this. It was towards the end of the War of 1812. All right, that was our second war against Britain. Not as big, not as long as the American Revolution, of course, but we had a second war, the War of 1812. And towards the end of that war in September, back to dates were the 13th and the 14th of 1814, that's when the Star Spangled Banner was penned by Francis Scott Key because of an incident that pretty much occurred at the end of that war and proved to the British that they can't win this war. And I think for all intents and purposes, it was the final act, and it's what ended the war. I'm going to get into that a little bit more, but just a little more history. In 1931. Now, by the way, some of these comments are my own. Some of these comments were some commentary I read by a conservative writer named Eric Erickson. So I want to give him some credit. Some of the facts I'm going to cite where I'm citing from him. So I'm going to be paraphrasing some of his stuff, mixing in some of my stuff. So just I want to give Eric Erickson some credit here. But in 1931, Herbert Hoover signed into law the portion of the United States Code that designates the poem, now known as the Star Spangled Banner, as the national anthem of this country. It was originally set to a British tune called, I don't even know how to pronounce it, To Anacreon in Heaven. That was the tune. Francis Scott Key penned the poem. The two were put together, and they became the national anthem. A very difficult one to sing, but it became our national anthem. The backdrop in the history here is at the end of that, a guy named Francis Scott Key was sent to negotiate a release of prisoner release deal with the British, whose fleet was parked outside of the Baltimore area, outside of Fort McHenry. And each side had prisoners. Well, while he's on the British fleet negotiating good faith, the British commanders tell him, listen, this is all going to be moot, because later tonight, and you're going to have to stay on board, you're going to be our prisoner overnight, but later tonight, you see that Fort McHenry over there? We are going to bombard that with the hundreds and hundreds of ships of the strongest naval fleet in the world, the British Army, and we're going to force that to surrender, and we think once we get that surrender, we're going to go on to win this War of 1812, whatever it was called back then. And so that night, certainly the shelling began. Now, Francis Scott Key was talking to the prisoners held below deck because they're saying, listen, the war is going to be over tonight. We'll free all the prisoners. We'll be back under British rule again, and all this is for naught. So just wait here overnight. We're going to bombard that Fort McHenry. So from the ship, Francis Scott Key is watching the bombardments. That's where you see the rockets' red glare and watching the flag on the ramparts. And apparently the British commanders had told the officials, they'd send an emissary or somebody to the fort to say, listen, when you've had enough of the bombing, when you're ready to surrender, you will lower that flag. You don't have to wave a white flag of truce or anything. You'll just lower that American flag, which at the time had 15 stars and stripes on it. But you will lower that flag, and then we will know you will surrender. And Francis Scott Key was made aware of this, that this was their demand or their communication to the patriots in Fort McHenry. Now, which weren't just military. There were women and children in there as well. And he said, you can't bombard that place. And, that's got women and children in there. They said, well, this is war, my friend. And so throughout the night, the British bombard it, and the flag's still waving. And all the prisoners down below are asking Francis Scott Key, is the flag still waving? Is the flag became the symbol of American freedom. It is the symbol of this country. And its waving was symbolic of not giving up the fight, of not surrendering to the British. And all night long, yes, the flag is still waving. Yes, the flag is still waving. Yes, in fact, overnight, what the original flag somehow got replaced with a larger flag. So not only did the American patriots keep flying the flag, they even put up in defiance a larger flag. Now, in other accounts I've read or heard about this, that even though the flagpole and the flag itself took direct hits and it was tattered and the flagpole was shattered, that American patriots manually held up the flag. We will not surrender. We will not. And they died. People hope because the British trained their bombs on that flagpole, knowing that when it came down, they won. And Americans manually held up that flag and died. And others came to replace them. And they died. And others came. And this happened throughout the night. And in the morning, when all the smoke had cleared and as the sunlight came on, Francis Scott Key could see that the flag was still there. Thus, the inspiration to his poem, which he originally named Defense of Fort McHenry, later became known as the Star Spangled Banner. It began to be played regularly at Independence Day celebrations. The U.S. Navy started playing it right before, 1899. President Woodrow Wilson in 1916 ordered it to regularly be played by the military. It wasn't our national anthem yet, but this is all the stuff that built up to its declaration of our national anthem. And in 1930, the veteran of foreign wars did put in a petition to have the Star Spangled Banner become our national anthem. And it did become that, as I mentioned earlier, in March of 1931. But recently, the revisionist left has tried to rewrite this story because they've keyed in on a verse in a phrase in the third verse. So let me read this to you. You'll understand where they're coming from, but then I'll tell you the truth of it. In the third verse of the Star Spangled Banner, it reads, quote, "No refuge could save the hireling and slave from the terror of flight or gloom of the grave, and the Star Spangled Banner in triumph doth wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave," end quote. Now, Gwen Berry, many left, what I'm about to tell you is, Gwen Berry is just one of these leftist activists. When she turned her back, she was signaling her protest to that phrase, the hireling and slave. And she was thinking, and they're ignorant of this, wrongfully thinking that slavery somehow was mentioning that the Star Spangled Banner somehow was glorifying slavery. Chattel slavery, which is the purest form of people owning other people, literally owning them. This kind of statement, this kind of belief that phrase in the Star Spangled Banner is a glorification of slavery is a statement that's born of revisionist ignorance. Key's poem was not about slavery. It was about an attack of Fort McHenry at Baltimore. When he mentioned slave, he was not alluding to African slaves in the United States South or anywhere else. At the time, the British, we all hired mercenaries. Those are the hirelings he talked about, mercenaries paid to come fight a war. They also had, as you know, many Americans were indentured servants, still under British rule, fighting the war. Slaves, in essence. So Francis Scott Key was referring to the British mercenaries and the British indentured servants who were called into action to fight against the Americans in that War of 1812. So that's what Key is referring to. But modern historians have twisted the truth. That he's really talking about how in that night, whether you are a hireling, a mercenary, or a slave of the British Navy, the indentured servants, you were doomed. You would go to your graves, and that Star Spangled Banner would keep waving. That's what that verse was about. It is purposeful, ignorant, and deceitful for anybody, Gwen Berry, the athlete, or leftist revisionist historians, to try to equate that verse into some kind of glorification by Francis Scott Key or the Star Spangled Banner of chattel slavery. And this is how the left deceives you. And this is how their whole entire agenda is based on a false narrative and ignorance of what really happened in this great country. Let me read to you the last verse, because it's beautiful, the fourth verse of the Star Spangled Banner. And then we'll move on to our guests. Fourth verse, quote, "Oh, thus be it ever when freemen shall stand between their loved homes and the war's desolation, blessed with victory and peace, may the heaven rescued land praise the power that hath made us and preserved us a nation. Then conquer we must when our cause is just, and this be our motto, in God is our trust. And the Star-Spangled Banner in triumph shall wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave." It was triumph over the British slaves, the indentured servants, and the hirelings, the mercenaries, that this song, triumph, war triumph, that this poem and song was about. So as you go into celebrating this July 4th, please keep that in mind. Please know how corrupt and ignorant the left is of our history. And I hope you've learned something a little bit today, like I have just in the past few days and weeks on this. All right, we're going to go to our first guest. Now, this is going to be a Liberty Bite segment. So this was pre-recorded a little bit earlier today, but our Liberty Bites are, a little shorter segments that talk about how certain policies take a bite out of our liberty. Has another false narrative in Rhode Island led to intrusive legislation that will infringe on our liberties? Welcome everybody back to another session of Liberty Bites. This is Mike Stenhouse, your host, and I'm being joined today, and I'm very pleased, very excited to have my old friend, Julie Gunlock. She is the Director for Progress and Innovation at the Independent Women's Forum. We're just a fabulous group of women who put out perspectives on all kinds of issues. Julie, welcome to our show.
Thanks for having me on.
All right, so pay equity legislation, after 3 or 4 years of battle in the state, apparently they've reached some compromises. We'll get into that, but it's finally going to be passed. It will be passed and signed by the governor in early July of 2021. You've commented publicly on national media entities on this. Just overall, your initial reaction to these frivolous pay equity bills that are sort of the rage right now.
They are the rage, and they're really hard to push back on, because the narrative is, why don't you want equal pay? Why don't you want women to make as much as men? And that's really hard, especially for male representatives and politicians, to say, it's not about that. And what people need to know is it's not about that. What these bills do is put regulations in place without in any way looking at the meaningful choices people make in the workplace.
Let's get into that in a little more detail in just a second. But this is another case, before we get into those choices you're going to talk about. And remember, employers here are having their liberties taken away right now by this bill. But again, it's based on a narrative that is not supported by the facts. There's not supported by concrete examples, and they're all already existing laws, the EEOC federally, right? I mean,
the 1964 Civil Rights Act, the 1963 Equal Pay Act, these are federal laws that make discrimination in pay illegal. You're absolutely right. This is piling on. This is layering on more regulations that make it harder. And let me explain something. We need to think about what is actually going to happen. This is going to take away women's freedoms. They're going to set a state level standard that every woman gets this amount of pay. It will take away women's ability to negotiate more flexibility, to negotiate her hours and ultimately her pay. And what people also need to remember is you look in Europe where these regulations are standard. In every European country, there's some sort of equal pay regulation. Women are not in upper management. They simply aren't, because they can't negotiate a thing, because there's just sort of this, everybody gets the same thing. It takes away their ability to negotiate.
Yep. Now, let me bring up something along those same lines, even more provocative, that I've heard from many employers, and just talked to one this morning about this, along the same lines, where this law may end up backfiring and taking a bite out of women's liberties. Some employers have told me if I'm at risk, and again, this law is not just women, it's minorities as well, and all the victim classes. Some employers have told me if I'm subject to these kinds of audits and penalties, I may just say, hey, I'm not going to be hiring any women or minorities at these upper levels.
Absolutely. It is this sort of hush conversation that goes on where, of course you can't say that out loud, but if you're looking at these applications and looking at all the regulations that might come with a female employee, you're going to say, whoa, wait, maybe that is something women need to understand. And again, when these laws take away your flexibility, maybe you work for your good friend and you say, you know what, I'd really, I'd like to be paid this much, but I only want to work 3 hours or 3 days a week. That might not be on the books. So when you look at a man and a woman, and some of these things aren't accounted for, it creates this idea that a woman is being paid less. That's a real problem with these kinds of legislative efforts. They look good, but they're terrible for women.
Yeah, they awful sound. And like you said, there's who wants to go to to be against pay equity? We're all for equal pay for equal work. This bill, of course, makes it very fuzzy. It's equal pay for comparable work. I mean, you can drive a truck through that loophole. Comparable work is what this bill says. All right, I want to go back to your point you were starting to bring up about choice, and I'm sorry, choices that people make, and I'm sorry for interrupting, but I wanted to set it up. Part of the narrative, we've all seen the national studies about women only make 70 cents per dollar. Well, according to data from a group called the National Women's Law Center, based on a Census's 2019 American Community Survey, whatever that is, women in Rhode Island, this is Rhode Island specific, make 85 cents on every dollar made by men, a difference of $8,700+ per year. I mean, Julie, this can't be allowed to stand.
Terrible. It's just terrible, right? Now let me tell you about how they do these, they make these findings, right? Is they compare, it's basically an apples and orange thing. They just compare men and women. They don't take into account the hours these people work. They don't take into account the education level, the industry they're in, the flexibility they've requested that might not, like I mentioned earlier, might not be on the books, right? They don't in any way take into account, I mentioned this, meaningful choices that people make that impact their employment status, right? Or the sort of secret, there are people that work at my organization, and I used to work on Capitol Hill, right? Where a lot of this stuff was sort of regulated. And I had a sort of a hush arrangement with my staff director who said, you work entirely at home, okay? Now you work entirely at home and you don't work on these certain days. There was a guy in the office that had pretty much similar background as I did, but he had to go to the office every day. He was actually meeting with constituents much more than I was and having sort of these in-person meetings. He made more than me, but because this was sort of an off the books thing, it looks that, we did the exact same thing. We had the same titles and I made less. these kinds of like arrangements that you might have after working for a decade or working 5 years or something with an employer that you like, they will go away. You will not be able to make these arrangements.
Isn't it also true, I mean, for instance, that a lot of women choose just lower paying career paths, such as social services and maybe education and
Exactly.
and whatnot?
Look,
I mean, if you were to compare doctors, men and women, you probably would see no difference or anything else like that, right?
Mike, I'm so glad you brought that up because this is really critical. 92% of women's studies majors are women. Okay. Now, when you graduate from college with a women's studies degree, you're not going to become an engineer. Okay. So when you look at like
high paying job, right?
When you look at the industries that pay people the most, engineering, petroleum, these kinds of jobs make the most. Okay. Those are mostly men. Now, of course.
And that's not by discrimination. That's by choice, right?
That's by choice. But of course, now let's remember, they'll come back to you and say, well, women are told they can't go into the hard sciences. They literally have gotten into myth making now. I don't know. There are so many STEM programs for women, and these have been going on for decades. They refuse to accept that men and women are different. Men might choose different majors that lead to jobs that make more money, and women choose to be social workers.
That's how a free society works, right?
Teachers and social workers, and sometimes the women choose these lower paying jobs so that they ultimately have flexibility with their families. They might want to be a teacher so they have their summers off. They might want to be a social worker so that they can work out of their home and be there with their children. I chose to work for a nonprofit so that I could work from home and raise my kids. These are the choices I make. Men don't make those choices. So if you're not going to account for but this gets down to the sort of feminist insistence that there is zero differences for men and women, and that's what drives these laws.
That's a great point. That's a terrific point. You know, I'm insulted on behalf of small businesses who, by inference, this law is saying you are naturally bigots and discriminatory.
Exactly. Yep.
You know, employers in this state are the salt of the earth. They make the state go. They make our country go. They're doing the best they can. Many of them don't have HR departments.
Right.
So there might be an inequity accidentally here or there. But the inference that employers are just discriminatory bigots really gets at me. Now, the Speaker of the House, Joseph Shekarchi, stood up before the vote on this bill or maybe after the debate on this bill and said, in his long career in the State House, he's only been Speaker since this January, that this is the most important bill that he has ever voted on.
Oh, please. First of all, give him 10 minutes. He'll figure out something else that's more important. This is ridiculous. The idea, this is the other thing, Mike.
They're brainwashed on a false narrative, right?
They're brainwashed, but it also infantilizes women, right? When
Wow.
he says, when he says this is the most important issue, as if women have been like tortured in this country, right? We're all waiting for the Rhode Island, legislature to pass this bill, and then we're all free. Women make choices in this country. Women have come a long way in this country, and it sort of reminds me a little bit of the CRT narrative that we're seeing. Like, your kids are being taught to hate their country and not recognize any good things. This is the same narrative when it comes to these pay equity bills, as if women don't have their own agency, they don't have their own choices, they don't have options. Women have so many options in the marketplace right now. And employers also know that in order to get good employees and to get loyal employees, so you're not like hiring everyone, another person every 3 months, you've got to offer them flexibility and offer them benefits that they want. And many times women will take benefits and flexibility over pay.
All right, last comment from you on this. I want to follow up on what you just said. It would be my contention that never before in the history of this country, or probably even the history of the world, and if we want to talk about women on this, again, even though this bill also includes minorities, but let's just stay with the women's theme, have women enjoyed such economic freedom, such prosperity, such parity, such respect, such professionalism, and such success as ever. And yet they continue to claim victim. How do you explain that?
Well, look, feminism and these women's organizations like this Law Center you talked about, they make money on perpetuating the idea that women are weak and need protections. And the protections and the help always comes from government. They make a lot of money on this narrative. If we actually said, hey, we're doing pretty good here. Where would these, I mean, we know it's like anything, any kind of advocacy group, what are they supposed to do if there's nothing left to advocate for? And so recognizing how far women have come, recognizing that women are different. Some women want to stay home with their children, but still kind of want to work. So they want more flexibility. Some women don't want to stay home. The idea that we don't have a wonderful system that has been created organically is folly. And you know who's going to suffer for this? Women. Women are going to suffer for this when they see less flexibility in the workplace, not being able to kind of create the life that they want. This is actually tragic, and I hate to see these sorts of laws happening state by state.
You know, I wish you'd just tell it like it was, Julie Gunlock. You know, I wish you would. Hey, listen, thank you for joining me on Liberty Bites today. Julie Gunlock, Independent Women's Forum. You know, if you haven't been to the site, you don't have to be a woman. IWF.org. I mean, the content, right? You allow men, right? Right?
We like men. We welcome men. You're allowed.
So go, men or women, go visit IWF.org, and there's just amazing content and perspectives on that website. Julie, thanks again for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
Good day. So while we focused a lot on this show on fighting for parents' rights in education, everything from being free from mandated sports and athlete testing to vaccine and mask mandates to critical race theory and gender equity and the over-sexualization of our kids. And you've seen groups of parents in localities across the nation on the news fighting back. There is a national group that's providing support and conducting its own fight against this indoctrination of our kids. And that's a group called Parents Defending Education. So I'd like to welcome the director of, or the CEO of Parents Defending Education, Nikki Niley. Nikki, welcome to In the Dugout.
Thanks for having me.
And it looks like you're on a baseball field with that AstroTurf and a baseline in the back, but I see you've got your Cubs hat on. Thank you for playing ball with us. A lifelong Cubbies fan?
I am, yeah. My grandparents actually used to live near Wrigley, and they would actually rent out their parking spaces in the backyard. So, yeah, it's been.
Well, then you must know who my friend Andre Dawson is, who finished his career with the Cubs. I played with him on the Montreal Expos in the early '80s. So we got that in common going for us. Okay, Nikki, Parents Defending Education. You're the president and founder. You've got a great background in advocacy, leading college free speech efforts. You've worked at the Cato Institute, the Independent Women's Forum, but now you're working in the educational space. And I don't know if your focus is on CRT, but just tell us why these parental rights and educational issues are so important to you.
Sure. I mean, I think about a saying that Dick Armey used to say, politics goes to he who shows up. And I think over the past year, if we can say that there is a silver lining to the pandemic, it's that suddenly parents had this opportunity to see what was taking place in the classroom because it was in their living rooms. And unsurprisingly, a lot of parents were really unhappy with what they saw. And so I think, if people care about this issue, either you have children in school or not, you should get involved. And so we wanted to give people both the knowledge and the tools to get involved. It doesn't matter what the letter is next to your name, but if you care about this, do something about it.
So we're taking a look at your website here, which we encourage everyone to go to, defendinged.org. And I like what you say here. Your grassroots organization, that means you're representing real parents. You're not a bunch of elites sitting up there in an ivory tower telling people what to do. You're getting parents involved. And basically, you're looking to fight against indoctrination in the classroom. So in your view, what forms, because it's a plural thing, are these indoctrinations taking shape?
Sure. I think it's mostly in the pedagogy, in the implementation of some of these ideas. I mean, We've seen a lot of education. We've seen a lot of classes where, students have to do a privilege walk. They have to locate themselves on an oppression matrix. People don't like doing that. They don't like being defined by their identity before all else. I mean, it really, it turns Martin Luther King's, judging people on the character, their character as opposed to the color of their skin. It turns that on its head. We're teaching children that immutable characteristics are the first and the most important thing about them. And I think that's wrong. It's divisive, and it really prevents us as a nation from forming the more perfect union laid out by our founders.
Absolutely. So let's talk first at a local state case. Of course, the South Kingston case with Nicole Solis has gained national attention as well as continued local attention. It's led to a very interesting series of events since then, from resignations to people wanting to change public access records laws. But first, I just have to ask this. Your group, by the corrupt South Kingston School Committee, was referenced by them as a national racist group that was backing Nicole Solis. First of all, you're a racist group?
We are not a racist group. We oppose discrimination of all students of all kinds. And sadly, to some people, that's not an okay point of view, but we're proud to oppose discrimination.
Yeah, if you oppose their view on race, you're a racist. That's usually how it works these days. Second of all, did you guys bring Nicole Solis to the forefront? Because that was the other thing that they just couldn't imagine, especially one radio host in this show couldn't imagine how Nicole's story could have gone national, that some group like yours must have catapulted her falsely into the national spotlight. What was your role in those early days with Nicole?
So we, as a membership association, we don't disclose the names of our members or our donors because a lot of people credibly fear repercussions. I mean, sadly, that's the time we live in. We operate on tips that are submitted to us. So we're receiving at this point between 100 to 200 tips a week from across the country.
Wow.
One of the tips we received was from South Kingston. We looked into it, we asked a question, and suddenly we have been tarred as being, as you said, a national racist organization. At the end of the day, look, we have tools on our websites. We encourage people to get involved. We have guides on how people can get involved in their school systems, anything from submitting a tip to us all up through filing their own public records request, learning about a PTA versus a PTO, running for school board. And so if our tools are used by individuals to look into and hold their own school districts accountable, great. I want every American, it doesn't matter, again, what the letter is next to your name, everyone should know how their tax dollars are being spent, because what is happening in America's schools is being done with our money in our names. And a lot of it is not okay. And so, to that point, if Nicole Solis has used our materials to figure out how to file a FOIA, and let's remember, she was told by the school to file a FOIA to get the information she requested, and then she was vilified. How dare they?
Thank you for saying that. Speaking of public records requests, in this state, and as I think you're probably well aware, and as Legal Insurrection website has pointed out in the past few weeks, so many, not just Nicole, but so many parents are now making public records requests. So many parents rightfully want to know what the hell is going on with the education of their kids. So many parents are making that now the left, the superintendents ultimately who have to respond, I guess, to these requests are now looking for the access to public records laws to be changed so that they can keep hiding like the cockroaches they are. Excuse me, they are. They're subverting American values, and I'll say that again if anyone challenges me to. What do you make of this push to change the laws so that they can remain operating in the dark?
It's undemocratic and it's un-American. I mean, again, the district, I think initially when she filed her request, she was given like thousands of dollars in estimates. And so she figured out if she broke it into smaller requests, they'd be responded to more quickly at a lower cost. That's just the system they set up. But again, this is something that local media outlets used to do. The Providence Journal used to and should be doing these things, yet they have absolutely fallen asleep at the switch. And so it's fallen to public citizens to figure out what the heck is going on with public dollars. That's a shame, But it's disgusting that a superintendent association in partnership with, I think as the email said, our union friends
Yep.
are trying to restrict public access to how our tax dollars are being spent. That is reprehensible. And it's something that all, not only Rhode Island citizens, all Americans should be cognizant of. If you are proud of how you are spending money, you should not be hiding it from us.
We're going to talk about unions in just a minute because I know you wrote a column on that recently. But let me stay on this records request. I mean, ultimately, records requests are about transparency, right? Parents want to find out things that aren't otherwise made publicly available to them. In your view, should every school district, I mean, wouldn't it obviate the need for all kinds of public records requests if just school districts would openly and honestly put their full curriculum, the syllabuses and everything else just online for everybody to see, any other directives given to teachers, and just put it up there?
Yeah.
I mean, that would save a hell of a lot of time, money, and effort if we just had more transparency in our school curriculum, wouldn't it?
Absolutely. The Goldwater Institute has a curriculum transparency bill to this effect. And sadly, it hasn't been taken up by a lot of states yet. I don't know why, because again, curriculum transparency should be a bipartisan issue. In the state of Texas, they have something called the 3-click law, where a public university in Texas, you have to be able to get from the homepage to a class syllabus within 3 clicks. So I can find out what my college junior is doing in the state of Texas, but not what my kindergartner is doing. That's preposterous.
Yeah.
And let's also remember, there are districts like in Rockwood, Missouri, where administrators have actually given teachers instructions on how to hide material from online classes. So, in the face of that, parents have every right and really need to chase down what their children are learning.
So when you say hide, and I agree, that's what they're trying to do. I mean, this is all, it's sort of, isn't it a derivative of the cancel culture where we don't want you to know what we're doing, and we don't want to, and we want to criticize you if you do something that we don't approve of. And I've always made the analogy that being woke is like having blinders on. You are only allowed to see what the woke masters tell you to see, and we'll only show you what our woke masters tell us we can show you. So isn't this kind of all tie in this culture of working subversively, of shutting down debate, canceling people, keeping things in the dark, and doing everything subversive? Isn't this the larger trend we're seeing from the left in this country?
Yeah, I mean, we're hearing from a lot of people that this is just a right-wing conspiracy. Well,
Right.
If it's a right-wing conspiracy, then why is the NEA voting on spending millions of dollars to advance their anti-racist work this week? Why are parents being smeared and dragged when they question or oppose it? And then, we're also seeing parents that are being talked down to. We're not teaching that in our curriculum. That's a complicated legal theory. No, you know what? The pedagogy and implementation of critical race theory is what we're seeing. We're seeing children being defined and treated according to their race and other immutable characteristics, and parents have a problem with it. So I don't care what you call it magical unicorn theory. People know when their kids are being discriminated against,
Right.
and they're mad.
And that's a key point, what you call it. The out is, well, there's no critical race theory, quote, curriculum, but all the principles of it and all the principles of the larger identity politics and, are in there. So this is really, it's not so much a piece of curriculum. There's really a pervasive culture.
Yeah.
That it's hard to define.
Mm-hmm.
It's hard to identify and pinpoint, in an email, in a records request, on a website. How can we fight against this culture that has pervaded so many teachers, so many other school officials and politicians? Do you have any thoughts on that? I mean, because it's not easily identifiable by name.
Right. And we're also starting to see a lot of the terms change too. I mean, the phrase critical race theory has suddenly become very toxic. And so we're
Right.
seeing schools say, no, we're doing social emotional learning. We're doing culturally responsive teaching. I think it's incumbent on parents really to dig into what's being taught, how is it being taught. I mean, I had to read Karl Marx when I was in grad school, but it wasn't supposed to be a playbook. It wasn't a how-to guide. We were encouraged to engage with material critically. And unfortunately, what we're seeing now is students don't have that opportunity. They're being taught there's one way to think, this is it. They're being told what to think, not how to think. And that's a disservice not only to the students, but also to our country.
All right. So in Rhode Island, we're aware of the South Kingston case. We've had on this show parents from cities you may not know, Charahoe and Westerly, and there's incidents in Barrington and elsewhere. What I'd like you to do is tell our Rhode Island viewers, what you from based on what you know in Rhode Island and what you know about what's going on nationally. Where is Rhode Island fit into this? Are we more aggressive with this kind of indoctrination in other states, or are other states doing this even worse than we know? Just give us some perspective here.
Yeah, no, one thing that we have on our website is a map. We call it our indoctrination map because we want to show people that this is taking place everywhere. I think there's a misperception that a lot of this is California and Manhattan driven, or, there's been some very high profile incidents in Rhode Island. It's not just on the coast. It's in red states, it's in private schools, it's in parochial schools. And so, it reminds me of that saying, the price of liberty is eternal vigilance.
Right.
Even if you send your kid to a private school or parochial school, you still have to keep an eye out for this stuff. And so I don't think Rhode Island is any worse necessarily, but it's definitely, not in like the top tier of like places that have kept this out yet.
Tell us a little bit more about some of the other indoctrination issues. I'm sure critical race theory or whatever the title is, we're just going to use that, is front and center. But is your organization, for instance, involved? I mean, it's Parents Defending Education. I interpret that, and we've used the term parental rights, that the government is trying to infringe on what should be the domain of parents. It may not be a expressed constitutional right, but we all know parents should have rights in raising their children, but yet the government and the schools want to start taking more and more over. So when it comes to testing mandates, mask mandates, vaccine mandates, and passports, are you guys involved in those kinds of issues as well? I mean, the over-sexualization of our kids. I mean, there's all kinds of issues where the government is infringing on parental rights. Are you guys involved in all those as well?
Yeah, we're keeping an eye on that. One issue that has come up a lot in the parental rights context is schools that are hiding a child's gender identity at school, which is different from what's happening at home, and not looping the family in. So actually, there was a Supreme Court decision that came down a few weeks ago, BLV Mahanoy, about Pennsylvania. We submitted an amicus brief in that to make the point that, there is, as schools have started to expand, where they claim jurisdiction over, to include the home, to include off-campus activities, they're very much blurring the lines. We've seen this happening in the university setting for years, where schools' bias response teams say everything online, if you're doing a study abroad, if you're on a spring break, that falls within our purview. Universities definitely have given themselves more power than local police forces by far. And now we're starting to see K-12 schools doing that too. So our brief that we submitted to the Supreme Court, and it's something that actually Justice Alito really picked up on, is, schools, K-12 schools during the school day have this whole in loco parentis, in place of the parents right. But now, we're seeing schools really set themselves up, not in place of the parents, but trying to actively undermine parents.
Yeah.
And so that's really this increasing tension. It didn't exist when I was growing up. I mean, I remember my teacher as a principal working with my family if issues came up. And so for schools to try and set themselves out as we're trying to deprogram you from what you might have learned at home is very problematic, and it's going to keep happening.
All right, you recently wrote a column how the nation's largest teachers unions choose indoctrination over education. We did a study about a year and a half ago. We analyzed and detailed the union spending, both at the state level and federally, and how it went like 99.9%, sometimes 100% to Democrats or to progressive left institutions or advocacy groups. We even had a section in there that showed how both, I think it was in 2019, both the American Federation of Teachers and the National Education Association defeated motions from the floor that said the primary mission of our organization should be to educate kids. Both of those organizations defeated those motions and instead said, no, our number one priority is to advance a social equity agenda and everything that goes with that.
Yep.
Talk about the role of teachers unions, whether it's this critical race theory or other far leftist propaganda that we see in our schools.
Yeah, and again, let's draw the distinction between there are good teachers, there are bad teachers unions out there. The NEA has their annual meeting this week. One of the issues that they have actually passed is to investigate groups that have been calling out teachers for their anti-racist work. And so, that's groups like us that they're going to come at us hard. So I guess, we're kicking the right hornet's nest, but of their $371 million budget they're voting on this year, I mean, some of the stuff that they're looking at is $36.2 million to protect and defend against legal attacks directed at the union and to support the nomination of pro-labor judges. $5.8 million to increase member capacity as leaders and activists, which includes recruiting and training educators to run for local office and school boards. $7.5 million to create and provide training resources and programming for members on racial and social justice and how to implement those practices in the classroom. I mean, we're spending all this money and all this time. There's no time left to educate our kids. Look at the learning losses that have happened over the past 15 months. How dare you claim to care about educating our children? You care about money, you care about power, and you do not care about our children.
So that's going to lead me to my final issue with you, but clearly teachers unions were behind most of these school systems not going back into session following the pandemic, right? I mean, they just, wanted to have it all perfectly safe. Of course, you can never be perfectly safe for the teachers. So given that the teachers unions have exposed their radical agenda, have exposed that they don't want to teach kids in person if they can stand it, they'd rather do it. Given that governments are now forcing parents and their kids to take tests, to get vaccines, to wear masks. In Rhode Island, just yesterday, they said kids are still going to be required to wear masks on buses, and unvaccinated kids are going to be required to wear masks in schools. Given this critical race theory and other indoctrination, I don't know if your organization is involved in this, but even if it's not, could you comment, doesn't this just make the case why more families should be empowered with more choices as to where they send their kids to school? If my school system's going to do this, and if I object so much, why should we be forcing parents to go to those school systems when most of them can't afford private school and most of them would have no idea how to start on homeschooling, although many are. So your thoughts on empowering parents with educational freedom?
Yes, I think it's a first step. It's crucial. I think it's necessary, but I think it's also not necessarily sufficient to defeat what's going on in our schools these days. Because right now I'm homeschooling one child. I have another kid in private school, but also, at the end of the day, they're going to have to go to school with kids that have been in the public school system that are still steeped in these ideas. They still have to go to, work with these people. And so I think it really, even if we are putting our kids in private schools, then we still need to kind of address the root cause of this. But choice is just an essential element to fixing some of this.
All right, I agree, but I'm going to say it's even more critical than that, because if we start, if students can start freely leaving these school systems because of these ridiculous policies and curriculum they're implementing, they'll change those policies. They don't want to lose all that money. We know it's all about money to everyone on the left. So,
right.
So I would argue that school choice is a weapon, not just as a weapon in fighting against these radical indoctrination. Anyway, that's just my thought. Nikki Niley, thanks for being with us. I'll give you, a final comment to Rhode Island parents out there. What should they do? Should they just sit back? How can they get involved locally, and how can you help them nationally?
We encourage everybody, get off the internet, get off Facebook and Twitter, and get out and make something happen. Go show up. And you know what? Showing up and doing something can be anything as simple as passing on an anonymous tip to us, and then we can publicize it, up through writing a letter to the editor, filing your own public records request, filing a complaint with the Office of Civil Rights. Hold the schools accountable. It is the only way that we will change them. Consider running for school board, vote for school board officials that push through these policies against your will. But we have to instill a level of accountability in the system. They have been allowed to get away with murder for years, and it's time to stop them.
What terrific advice. Nikki Niley, president and founder of Parents Defending Education. Thanks for joining us today. Hope you'll consider coming back, and thanks for wearing your Cubbies hat.
Thanks.
And as always on Thursdays, we welcome back the esteemed, continually validated Dr. Andrew Bostom. Andy, welcome back in the dugout. As you can see, I've got my July 4th gear on. You have your Husky cap on. You want to put in a plug for your alma mater?
Oh, it's not my alma mater.
Oh, it's not yours. Okay, all right.
But loved ones go there, so.
All right, fair enough. And again, I just got to tell all our viewers that while the local media has ignored all except for a couple of people, us and one radio host, have pretty much ignored everything you've had to say as being outside of the mainstream narrative, and you've been proven right on everything. And I mean, literally everything that went against the conventional wisdom has proven true. So I just want anyone who doesn't know you from that to know that. So let's jump right into, you know, the new fear mongering from the left. It doesn't seem like it's gaining steam, but why don't you stamp on it anyway? The Delta variant. Here's Go Local Providence. Who is this Dr. Fine anyway? I mean, this Dr. Fine has been nothing but trying to raise fear for the last 15 years.
Yeah,
Former health director here. Yeah. So anyway, talk about him. Talk about the Delta variant.
You know, I mean, he reflects sort of the unfortunately the prevailing current in the medical academy, which is no different than the rest of the academy. These are primarily left-wing ideologues, unfortunately, Mike. I have to say this. There are exceptions, but he epitomizes that sort of lockstep way of thinking, and
which is to make medicine fit the political narrative, right?
Absolutely, absolutely, and it's always a left of center narrative, a social justice narrative, and you know, he's you could say, if you want to get a little nostalgic, he's kind of a Woodstock throwback, but you know, it's not humorous anymore. I sort of, you know, I don't find the humor in that anymore. These really have become sort of neo-Marxist ideologues. That's we have to call them what they are.
All right. Now, what about the Delta variant? Here's a headline where Senator Rand Paul basically showed that this scary Delta variant has a death rate even lower than the original COVID.
And that's probably, Mike, and that's probably an exaggeration, because these are more, I would say, these are more case fatality rates. They're not looking at the full gamut of completely asymptomatic infections. So,
right.
But the point is, he's right. It however you want to measure it, you know, case fatality rate being more sort of symptomatic cases, identifiable cases, infection covering the whole gamut of infections. Would make it even lower, but in proportion to the original Wuhan strain, or then in the UK the Kent variant, the B.1.1.7 variant. If anything, it's less virulent. In India, I wanted to tell you that, you know, where the strain, you know, came from and did cause a significant uptick in infections and hospitalizations and deaths in the spring. I'm just looking at data from a COVID dashboard for the Delhi region, which was hard hit. And they're showing that between May 12th and June 13th, the COVID beds went from 82% down to 8%. The beds that required oxygen went from 85% to 8%, the COVID oxygen beds. And then COVID in the ICU went from, you know, being really pretty much overwhelming, 99% down to 16%. And, you know, so we're you know, you're seeing that this dramatic uptick in India, which by the way, let's also be clear, India,
positive cases, right?
No, but also India, in terms of COVID mortality per capita, is way below the United States and the UK, for example, way below, a third of the mortality. So, you know, we have to keep that all in perspective.
All right. So if it's the Delta variant is the India strain of the original China virus. If so, just a fun technical question. So if it's a variant of the original China virus, is it still the China virus?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah.
It is. Okay.
Yeah.
It's not like some new thing, right?
No.
Okay. All right. That was just for fun. All right. Here's a serious question. You know, I love these headlines that the Delta variant is becoming the predominant strain of cases identified, for instance, in Rhode Island. It's going to, well, we're getting about 10 or 12 new cases a day. And if 4 of them are the Delta variant, do we really care?
No, No,
I mean, the
it's-
statement is true, right? It's the predominant strain, but
It's
it's
nonsense.
it's a BS statement, right?
That's exactly. That's the appropriate perspective. And there's no national uptick in infections or hospitalizations or deaths that are being caused by it. It's just more panic pornography. It's the same. These are the same tropes that they've been pushing through the media. And it's really quite discouraging. And we saw an example of that yesterday, or at the press conference, the last press conference.
Yep, and I'm putting up the headline of that.
Look at that picture, Mike. If you can blow up the picture of Dr. Scott in her, it looks to be some sort of N95 variant, maybe mask. Enormous. It's ludicrous, but it's not just ludicrous. Again, these are serious matters now. This is a woman that's fully vaccinated, that heads the Rhode Island Department of Health. And the message is, I'm wearing that mask because we need to force vaccinate children. I mean, this is a very, very destructive message.
She admitted it was symbolic.
Right.
And yet they step all over their same message. I mean, we all thought that the vaccines would help us return to a normal, maskless, no social distancing lifestyle. But yet, at that press conference yesterday, and as we highlighted in yellow, they're going to still require, vaccinated or not, every child to wear a mask when they're on a school bus.
Oh, yeah, because supposedly that's some ridiculous federal regulation. I mean, particularly in the warm weather, why on
Federal
earth
regulation?
Yeah. Why on earth couldn't they just open the bus windows? I mean, that they would be incredibly ventilated. As a matter of fact, they should do it while the kids are wearing the masks, and then they would blow out the window. They'd be ticketed for littering, maybe. But it's just we're really in the theater of the absurd now. And except it's not funny. And once again, kids are getting the blank end of the stick. And it's just outrageous. So under 12, obviously they all have to be masked in school all the time because they can't get vaccinated. And
let me just set that up a little better for everybody, because not everyone knows what you and I know. So the rule apparently is going to be when so everybody's got to wear a mask on the bus, every student. When you get to school,
mm-hmm.
If you've been vaccinated and can prove it, and apparently they already know, because your medical privacy means nothing anymore.
Yeah, that was also kind of interesting, wasn't it?
Yeah, it wasn't. They just said, well, we know that if you're vaccinated, you don't have to wear a mask, and if you're not vaccinated, you do have to wear a mask all day while in school. Now, we're going to get to the study on whether masks are good or bad, but without saying the words, they have just implemented a vaccine passport. Have they
absolutely.
not?
Absolutely. Certainly for the kids, I guess, that are between 12 and 17, 12 and 18, that are eligible to get this EUA vaccine. Yes, that it is a vaccine passport, because the kids that are vaccinated 12 and above will not have to wear masks in school, whereas the kids that aren't vaccinated. So it's a huge coercive pressure. And then I would argue it's also a coercive pressure on the parents to get the kids under 12 vaccinated the instant any sort of EUA might be issued between now and the fall. And that's also disgusting as far as I'm concerned, because Mike, we're dealing with real hard evidence in our state. Just between 12 and 17, we've had 4 hospitalized cases of myopericarditis, this inflammation of the heart itself and the pericardial sac that suspends the heart. And this is not trivial. They're all in the hospital. We don't know the long-term sequelae, the long-term consequences of having myocarditis, even if it's quote unquote mild. We have no idea about it. It's an autoimmune form, because these kids aren't infected with anything. They can't find any infections. But
they won't tell us, will they, how many children are in the hospital because of COVID?
I don't think there are any right now, Mike. I mean, that's my guess. There are hardly any people hospitalized. And by the way, it's still
only 21, right?
Yeah, it's still with and from, not just from. Okay, so we're dealing with the same problem that we've been dealing chronically, which is that there's no effort to be transparent about who is actually in with a COVID pneumonia, or in the case of children, you might argue not just a COVID pneumonia, but particularly the ones under 12, they get this inflammatory syndrome. If you took those two codes and asked about them, we don't know how much further dramatically it would be lowered. In Canada, when they looked at children, the entire pediatric age range hospitalized with at least a diagnosis of an acute respiratory illness, that was only 37% of the total so-called COVID hospitalizations in the pediatric range. So there's no transparency from our Department of Health about this information, and yet they want to go gangbusters and deal with vaccines, which frankly, I don't think these vaccines are safe enough to give to healthy people under 30.
All right, so once again, let's make that point once again. As you have been saying and for months, the evidence was pointing there. Now the WHO, the CDC, the FDA, and anyone else who
the U.S. Army, by the way, too.
The U.S. Army is now understanding that there is greater risk for young, healthy people.
Well, they won't say that,
take
Mike.
the vaccine than to not take it, right? They're all understanding that,
let's be clear. The data have been presented. None of those agencies, or including the U.S. Army, will reach that risk-benefit conclusion. But they've presented enough raw data that you can draw it for yourself. You know, the other thing that neither the CDC nor local state departments of health have ever done, which absolutely needed to be done, is present not just, you know, the total number of people hospitalized or the grim mortality statistics on the basis of age groups, but age groups with and without comorbidities. Because what we're talking about with a lot of these adverse reactions to vaccine are perfectly healthy people. It's more tragic when they're less than 30, but it's tragic at any age range. If people are devoid of comorbidities, and you could have a more realistic appraisal of what their risk for serious COVID disease was based on real disease, respiratory disease, again, in the case of kids, maybe an inflammatory syndrome, and then you could separate out those that have chronic comorbidities, particular things like diabetes and obesity and lung disease, versus those that don't have any of those in each age range. Then you'd begin to say, well, you know, this person is 65 years old, but they're healthy as a horse. What is their real risk for COVID? We don't have that information presented to us. It's very, very inappropriate. Yep. You know, as a matter of fact, Mike, when Pneumovax, this vaccine to protect people from community-acquired pneumococcal pneumonia, what penicillin was originally designed to treat, and it's still with us, and it still can cause serious illness. For anyone under 65, it was only people that had significant risks, particularly diabetes and lung disease, for whom this vaccine was targeted. It was a rational approach. We've abandoned that sort of rational approach to this mass vaccination approach.
Indiscriminate,
You had to see, Mike, the data that Ron Johnson's hearing presented. It was absolutely stunning, showing.
All right, we only got a few minutes left. I want to go on to masks now. We've covered the vaccination dangers. You've been a hero on that. Let's spend some time on masks. Now, this notion that Rhode Island students are going to have to wear masks if they're not vaccinated, even on the bus. You pointed out in a recent tweet, and I'm putting that tweet up right now, that the Journal of American Medicine,
the Journal of the American Medical Association,
put out that the CO, not only do we know from other data that masks don't work,
right?
They actually could be harmful.
Well, what they're finding, Mike, is they did a controlled study of children, and what they found was that they sampled the ambient air that collects inside the mask, and according to the German government standards, the level of carbon dioxide that accumulated within those masks, and there was an inverse relationship between the height of that peak of carbon dioxide concentration and age, which is what that figure is showing. In other words, the youngest were most susceptible to this, maybe because they take smaller breaths, and so they're.
I was wondering why that might be. Why
smaller, more rapid breaths, and so more carbon dioxide accumulates inside the compartment that they're in.
By a factor of 6.
by a factor of 6 above what the limit was set by the German government.
After just 3 minutes of wearing a mask.
That's right. That's
Never
right.
mind a full school day.
And it makes sense, Mike, in terms of some of the symptoms that were being dismissed that kids were complaining of, you know, inability to concentrate and headaches and things like that. In fact, there was an ICU nurse study, and this is a very different type of setting where they were in a medical ICU and they had to wear N95 respirators because people were actively infected with respiratory illnesses. But even the nurses complained of some of the same symptoms after a long shift, and they had measurable increases in their by indirect measurements, not invasive, not a blood gas where you literally cannulate the radial artery, but non-invasive testing seemed to confirm an increase in their PCO2s, their blood carbon dioxide levels, and once again, it sort of correlated with symptoms. It wasn't into a critical range or anything like that. But, you know, that's an occupational setting where it's appropriate. To
could this reach the level? I mean, a factor of 6, I don't know what that means medically. Right. I mean, could we be approaching CO2 poisoning, or is it just sort of something that's high, that's not desirable? You know, put it in perspective here.
Well, what's missing from the study, Mike, is even a non-invasive assessment of what their blood levels were. So in other words, I think it's a bad sign. The kids are complaining. They're clearly being subjected to a much higher concentration of CO2 than you would want. But what's actually happening in terms of the blood CO2, the PCO2, there's no even direct non-invasive measurements of that. So it is a limitation of the study. But on the other hand, I mean, it's certainly a good inference that, and done in a controlled way, that the environment that they're, you know, enclosed in has very high levels of CO2.
Would that be worse in an enclosed space in a hot classroom? Would that be worse?
Probably. I mean, probably. But the point is, even if it's a very minor inconvenience and the symptoms, you know, can dissipate quickly after they take the mask off or they go to a break or something, they're useless to begin with. Right. You know, I mean, you know, everyone seems to sort of forget about that. You know, these, I'm sure these findings will be discussed, but you know, it sort of avoids the main point, which is that you don't impose a mandate and an intervention which is proven to be useless. In fact, it's worse in children, Mike, because all the studies we've discussed, the randomized controlled trials, the 12 consecutive negative trials between 2008 and 2020, all were conducted in 18-plus-year-olds. When parents in the UK complained about the reinstitution of masking after the long winter break, they said, please do a study. Show us that it really is helping our kids. The British Health Service refused to do the study because they know it would be negative. Mike, if adults have difficulty, whether it's Hajj pilgrims or all these different settings, the university, college campus settings, everywhere they did this, one of the problems with the studies, which were all negative, was that, you know, after a while, people become less compliant. Can you imagine how truly compliant in a randomized controlled study kids would be with these masks? I mean, it's just ridiculous.
So, yeah, and you said it best right off the top. It is so absurd what we're seeing. We had, I don't know if you saw the segment, we've had her on a few times, Claire Stottmuller. She's an opera singer. She sang this great, she did a performance of this great 1940s song, To This We've Come, which rebukes communism and totalitarian government. She said, this was an opera, right? This was an aria from an opera. He says, but when you look at all this absurdity going on, don't you feel like this whole thing is just a staged production and we unwittingly are in this play and we don't have any control over it? So with that in mind, last comment to you, what you saw yesterday from our education, health, and the governor about these outmoded, now we know they're outmoded and ineffective mandates for masks and vaccines. Just your comments on the leadership in this state that you're seeing.
It's not leadership. These are coercive apparatchiks, and I don't know. It's very disappointing to see the governor be so weak-willed that he can't just end this. Other governors have. Other governors have ended mask mandates in schools for kids. have rebuked the idea of vaccine passports at any level, certainly within elementary and intermediate and high schools. This is being done across the country. He's apparently too weak-willed and really sort of factually challenged to be able to do this. It's kind of disgraceful, Mike. We need real leadership now. And he's just a milksop. It's terrible.
Yeah, and that lack of leadership and that blind adherence to whatever agenda they're adhering to.
But isn't it odd, Mike?
When we see these studies about how masks can actually harm kids, I mean, it is. We've said it before on the show. It is pure child abuse.
It is abusive. But Mike, think of that image again of his Department of Health director standing there with a mask, and he's down with it. He's okay with it. You know, a real leader would say to her, "This is absurd. Take that off. If you want to discuss masking children in schools, make your case, but you don't have to stand there with a symbolic mask on. You're a fully vaccinated public health official. Stop doing that in front of me."
You know, when you see stuff like that, we know we're being manipulated. Dr. Andrew Bostom, once again, thank you. Have a wonderful July 4th. Please don't forget to celebrate the great values and history of this nation. And I'm sure you will, as I will. It's why I'm wearing what I'm wearing. God bless, Andy. Thank you.
Take care, Mike.
All right. So again, just powerful commentary from our guests. So as again, we go into this July 4th celebration, pre-celebrate the liberties that we're supposed to have. And don't forget about how the left is trying to take those liberties away. We saw that today. You know, we saw that with the misinterpretation of the Star Spangled Banner. We saw that with our first guest in our Liberty Bite about how this pay equity law is going to infringe on the liberties of employers and probably backfire and infringe on the liberties of women. We saw it with our second guest about how they're trying to infringe and mischaracterize America's history with whether it's critical race theory or some of these other divisive identity politics, and how parents across America are standing up and fighting back. And of course, we saw it in our discussion just a few minutes ago with Dr. Bostom, how in this state, they want to infringe on the freedom of our parents and our students by forcing them to wear masks when they're useless and even harmful, and even implementing a form of vaccine passports. Our freedoms are under assault. We will win because we will fight back because we have a just cause. And by the way, I should mention that it's because of that line in Francis Scott Key, in that fourth verse, "In God is our trust," that ultimately became our national motto, I think officially designated so in the 1950s or so. Celebrate our liberties, defend our liberties. The fight is still on. Keep that in mind this July 4th weekend. Not sure when we're going to do our next show. We're going to take somewhat of a break. We'll do occasional shows over the summer. So I hope you'll join us again on In the Dugout soon. You'll certainly let us know. We'll let you know via email. Please subscribe to this channel. You'll get notifications for that. But enjoy your holiday weekend. Celebrate our independence. For Mike Stenhouse in the Dugout, see you next game.